So, good afternoon, everyone. This is Designing Drupal 8. I'm Lewis Nyman, a front-end developer and a designer. I'm a freelancer. And I'm also the maintainer for the 7 admin theme, which, if you don't know it, is the default admin theme for Drupal.
I'm Bojhan Somers, and I'm a user experience designer. And well, I work on the UX of Drupal, and I'm a maintainer, UX maintainer of Drupal 7 and now Drupal 8. So today we want to talk about kind of the design process that we took for the new style guide for Drupal, and kind of our desire to raise the bar in terms of the user experience and the visual style of Drupal. And we're talking specifically about the admin style. So let me start it. So let me first kind of give you an impression of why we thought a style guide would be needed and why we needed to kind of revamp the style of Drupal 7 in Drupal 8 now, obviously. We made a lot of changes to Drupal 8, and not a lot of those changes are very consistent in terms of their visual style and their user experience. And that's really because we kind of lack kind of a central guideline as to how things should be. And that makes for a rather inconsistent experience. So it's something you might not notice when you're using it, but as you're going through it and looking at different screens, you might notice the inconsistencies. Especially if you put 2 screens next to each other, you might see it even more. An example of that is this. In Drupal 8, we have about 5 different styles for buttons now. These are 2 styles for primary buttons. This is the save style. It's all different, different rounded or border radiuses and different colors and all of that. Clearly, this isn't very helpful for the end user, knowing what they mean, what they do.
And also, none of them actually look very good.
Yeah,
sorry.
Yep. And for the developer, contrib developers have to choose which one do I use, which one is the right styling to apply, and that isn't really clear. So it's also a little bit out of date. If you look at the 7 theme now, back when it was introduced, it was fairly new. But if you look at kind of the dribble styles, which is really the kind of popular design thing now, is that it looks a little bit dated. And that's kind of part of its design as well. Like when Mark Bolton initially designed the 7 theme, it's humble. It's not there's not a lot of ornamentation, or there's not a lot of big gradients and stuff like that. It's really part of the style that it's humble and very clean. And that kind of fits Drupal's brand. So in itself, it isn't a bad design, but it can be improved upon, for this time, especially when you look at things like, the iOS or Lumia. It's something that has come up in the last 4 years since Drupal 7 has been out, and it's really 2 new styles, especially the Metro style. So that's the one on the right from Windows, and that's used on Nokia Lumias as well. Has really been defining for a lot of new UIs that come out. And if you look at our team, it's not as pretty, and a lot of designers who look at our system evaluate it and go through it and are kind of set off by the fact that it's so ugly. So that's something that we looked into, and how can we resolve that? And it's very tempting, for us, but also for designers who come into Drupal, to take this interface and just update it to the new kind of style of that moment. So it might be the Metro style now. A few years ago it was kind of the Bootstrap style. So it's very tempting to just copy that style and go with that. But since 7 is for many people, many end users like authors, it's kind of the main way that they interact with Drupal. It's how they perceive the brand. So as these new styles come up, we need to make sure that we kind of pick a style and stay with a style that can last for a few years. Especially because installs don't always get updated very quickly. It might be that people are running with that same 7 style for 6-7 years maybe even. So It has to kind of really stand the test of time. So let me quickly show you kind of the process that we took to redesign 7. So the first steps that we took is in the community. We went to Bad Camp and I met with Ryan there. He's a designer slash front-ender slash UX guy. And we basically spent a whole lunch meeting kind of talking about how the design of 7 should be for it to really feel and look the way that we think it should look in 2013. A small disclaimer. Style is a really personal thing. Like if you like light blue or dark blue, or if you like rounded corners or very sharp corners, that's a very kind of subjective thing. And obviously there's a lot of graphic design kind of principles that apply, but in essence, especially a lot of discussion around style tends to be very subjective and very personal. But the style also has to have an opinion. Like we can't do kind of committee design and have this white design and black design and say let's choose the middle, let's go with a gray design, because that will make for a very boring design, right? It's not something that really stands out or has an opinion. And the last thing, it's a hard thing to crowdsource, because everyone has their kind of different view. Every designer has a different view of how it should be, which makes it hard to crowdsource the whole effort, because you need really a consistent style that can be implemented across all of Drupal. But besides these things, it's also something, it has to be accessible, it has to be mobile friendly, and it has to provide consistency across 20,000 modules. So when we're doing the style, we need to make sure that contrib maintainers can actually use it effectively. So the process that we took was a pretty common design approach, where you diverging, so you're trying out all kinds of IDs, and then you're converging, where you're kind of choosing the IDs that you want. And we spent about 3 months in bi-weekly meetings with Ryan, Roy, and me, redefining and identifying what the Drupal brand is and how we can make it work. And we did a lot of brainstorming, Photoshop file kind of ping-ponging to find what's the detail that we need. And Ryan spent a lot of time each meeting making new revisions and making kind of a final version for that meeting, so that it can really go into the details. And I think we did about 5 major revisions over the course of those 3 months. And then we posted our results to the UX team meeting, which is every Monday. And we put out a proposal on groups.drupal.org. And this was really to show the whole community what we've been doing and kind of a rationale as why we think the design should be like this. This probably took us like a month to write up, because it's communicating something like this into the community. You need to really have a kind of a good background as why you made those choices, because it can be very subjective, and when it isn't exhaustive and it isn't really going into detail as why certain choices were made, a lot of discussion will be kind of uninformed as to why we chose a certain selection style or why we chose a certain font. So that's something that we took a lot of time on writing, because we know from experience in doing design in the community that unless you have a clear description and clear rationale for even the smallest changes, that people might get kind of upset or uneasy about the fact that you didn't think it through, even though you did. I think a lesson as well for this is that we need to get it out earlier. We probably took a little bit too much time writing it. Yeah, but that's something for next time. So if you look kind of at the primary principles of designing it, and I'm going to show you to you in a second, is we chose a very kind of neutral palette. So it's desaturated, so it's not really bright colors, but there's good contrast, and it's the colors themselves are relatively calming. And it should be aesthetically appealing, obviously. but it should use kind of a minimal style. It's not Metro, but it shouldn't be all out there like a lot of those Dribble designs or Joomla or other tools. They have a lot of a lot of fluff around it, a lot of ornamentation to emphasize the design. And we thought in Drupal's case that's not really part of our brand to do that. But it's also an evolution, so it's not a major redesign. It's really tweaking details and making sure that issues that we found in Drupal 7 that are difficult in terms of usability and aesthetics, that we fix those. So there we go. It's quite fast, isn't it? Should I just show it again?
It's the easy. You can't adjust the easy on Keynote, so it would have been about half an hour to have it move.
Well, here we go. So yeah, the form styles, progress bar, style fields. We can show more in detail.
We'll post the link.
Yeah.
I think it might be easier.
Yeah.
Part you don't want us to see is where it goes.
No, it's actually blurred. The designs are just blurred like that.
As well, there's a huge PNG that you can see. But we also looked at, for example, the icons. As you might have noticed, our icons are a little bit inconsistent and a little bit, ugly, especially in like messages. It's something that we designed and we didn't take that much time for Drupal 7. So for Drupal 8, we have like a set of icons that we can now use, and all of you here can use as well to really have a consistent style. So let's take a really close look at some of the things that we did. So for example, we made a palette, a color palette, and there's a secondary palette as well. But these are kind of the main colors that are used in the 7 theme. And you might recognize some of them. If you're using the overlay, you might not recognize this one, but burlap is like the background on titles, and it's used for tabs as well. And the Drupal blue is kind of used for all links and a lot of actions and buttons, and the text and obviously background. But in all, the color palette has to be kind of light, and it has to be kind of desaturated. It has to feel kind of natural. And then we looked at the font. And more largely, we looked at kind of the typography that we're using. And we look at Sensors Pro as something, it's a kind of a humanistic typeface, which makes it kind of more applicable to Drupal. And it was chosen for reasons like legibility, and it's arguably better than what we're using now. It's like Lucida is what we're using. But we know this is kind of a tricky thing because, fonts and typefaces and GPL doesn't really work well together. For some reason, typeface designers aren't really keen on releasing anything GPL, so there's all kinds of other licenses. So we know there are some complications around that, getting something like this into core. So we're already working on at least getting a lot of the typographic elements like the line height and kind of the white space around a lot of text, fixing that with Lucida, making sure that looks nice and that it takes over some of these elements. And hopefully we figure out a way to get a humanistic font in. But yeah, that's not an easy task. And then obviously, if you're taking something like Drupal, you have to take into account all of the accessibility standards that apply. And we have to be WCAG compliant, not AAA, because that's even stricter. So we're using AAA generally across core. And we have to have a certain, sure.
Yeah, not version 2?
Oh yeah, sure, version 2, yeah,
Version 2
sorry.
to be UK.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, version 1 is really old now, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're using WCAG to AA for everything, all of the ARIA stuff as well. So there's certain contrast ratios that we need to hit. And I'm not sure if anyone of you have used Drupal 8 lately, But if you use something like contextual links, it will be nearly impossible right now to actually read the text when you're hovering over an item. That's because the contrast is so low. So hopefully we'll solve problems like that with this design. And contrast, isn't only about accessibility. It's also about we don't have any like large, bold areas of color. We felt that wasn't really the style that Drupal should be using. But there are, the same thing goes for shapes. Bold shapes are really reserved for titles and headings, and it's not used elsewhere. And then finally, well, the model dialog. Well, you can't see the header. One of the key things that we thought the Drupal style should be around is it has to be relatively friendly and calm. So we really looked at what kind of ornamentation or roundness can we introduce to make it a little bit more easy on the eye. And two key parts of this design is it's a little bit more soft, and you'll see that transpire across all of the elements that we designed. So a little bit more soft edges, not too many big contrasts between elements. And this is all kind of to communicate that more friendly, more natural design, rather than the more stark kind of metro look. So we hope that is something that will come up along the lines. So there will also be kind of no ornamentation, as far as I know. There's no like patterns that we apply to backgrounds, which is also really popular now. No textures. If we use gradients, they tend to be relatively easy on the eye. There's no like large contrast, going from really black to really white or something like that. So we're only using that whenever it's enhancing the visual look of a certain element. And then the last thing is it's all rather minimalistic. So this is, for example, a redesign of the tables. And we're trying to use more kind of white space. We're trying to remove as many unnecessary lines, or at least lines that might be guiding but aren't. For example, the zebra striping that we initially had on a lot of large tables, it makes it relatively hard to read, even though it's aimed at helping that. So we introduced like a hover style, which makes it easier to see. And well, those are kind of some of the key principles that we applied. And well, Lewis is going to talk a little bit about what's in now and how we're going to work on that.
Sure. Thanks, Bojhan. Does anyone have any questions at this moment in time? Okay. So, I was going to mention what's already in core. So this is the work in progress. Not everything is in now, but we've got the messages in. The icons are mostly in. The new styling for vertical tabs, which is actually pretty subtle, is in now. The new progress bar is in, and the new admin navigation listing is in already. But what I really want to talk about with the style guide is where we go from here. So the style guide isn't just, in my eyes, it's not something that just represents the visual design and the look and feel of all the UI components. It can also document where we should use these components and how we should use them. And in the future, I hope that the style guide can become kind of like a living documentation for designers and core developers and contrib developers to help them create better, more usable interfaces in Drupal. And beyond Drupal 8's release, I think we can expand the style guide even further to accommodate even more patterns that are found in contrib and other places in core, so it becomes a better toolkit for developers. So it's not it's an obvious fact that there are way more developers in Drupal than designers. We barely have enough designers right now to deal with all the different pages and interfaces that are built and generated in core. And there are about 20,000 contrib modules out there, and we have absolutely no chance of being able to go and help advise every single developer of every single contrib module with a designer. It won't happen. So we have to kind of admit that there isn't a Drupal site out there that doesn't at least install one contrib module. So we have to kind of we have to admit that the experience of using Drupal goes way beyond just core. But I think the only way we can solve this is, instead of trying to find more designers to help more contrib developers, is to use a style guide to create a better toolkit so developers in contrib can create their own better interfaces and consistent UIs. So let's look at some of the contrib modules as they are now. So some contrib modules just take existing patterns that we already have, and they kind of lean on them very heavily, almost to the point of where they break. So this is panels, and I remember there was a lot of fanfare I remember a lot of talk about vertical tabs coming in as a new UI component. It was a big deal. And panels leans quite heavily on vertical tabs. You can see we actually have vertical tabs inside of vertical tabs inside of vertical tabs. And along the top, we have horizontal tabs as well. And actually, I still don't think I understand this interface. Again, it's not necessarily the fault of the developer. We don't really give them a lot of help. They kind of have to figure it out for themselves. Tables. So tables is the default way that we list any item in Drupal. It's kind of like if we show anything, no matter what it is or how many items it has, even here where we have like an associated information and a button, it goes in a table. Which I guess is kind of consistent across the Drupal, but I think there are better ways of displaying information sometimes. This is a quote that falls into my head quite a lot when I work with the Drupal. And as it happens, Aral is actually speaking at the keynote tomorrow, so if you can make it tomorrow, please do try. It will definitely be worth it. And some other contrib modules, like they do realize that there's no existing UI they can use to accomplish the job they're trying to do. So they just kind of go off on their own and they create their own UI for various different levels of success. But that still creates an inconsistency across Drupal, and you kind of feel like you're in your own separate interface that doesn't really work with the rest of Drupal. And Views is a good example because Views is in core now, but it still maintains a lot of unique patterns and components that don't exist anywhere else in core. And then I think the majority of modules kind of fall back to the most simple interface there is when you need to get a task done, they just throw a form at you. And I it's kind of the safe option for me. If a user needs to get a task done, just give them a form and eventually they'll get to the bottom. But I think there are better ways of showing interfaces than just a flat form that goes straight down. So, interface guidelines. I kind of want to talk about how we can use interface guidelines, or how they are used now, to document components and inform developers of when they're used and how they can be used. And when they're done well, they can offer consistent experiences across systems when there are actually many fragmented tasks going on. Like imagine a mobile operating system with many apps. A good system guideline can make them feel consistent and more intuitive. And a bad system guideline can make everything feel fragmented and unpredictable and confusing. So when I first saw this presentation, the iOS 6 design guidelines were up, and I was actually going to critique them a little bit, but I checked this morning and they've updated them with the iOS 7 ones, obviously, and they're actually really good, a lot better. They include best design principles and guidelines, as well as UI examples for developers, and you can see here's an example of the progress bar. They show what it is, and they show its purpose, what it does, and why it should be used, and then it links directly to the API to show you exactly how to implement it. The Windows 8 design guidelines offer design principles as well, advice on touch gestures, animations, and they even describe how the app should work when the window resizes. Oh, and they also have an app UX checklist, so you can check off all the best practices before you launch your app. It's a pretty good idea. The Ubuntu design documentation sits on its own subdomain, design.ubuntu.org. And it's very clever. It outlines their audience spectrum as well. So they have these switches between community or commercial, consumer or enterprise or end user and developers, and they give you different advice depending on the user you're talking to. And they also provide loads of examples of all the Ubuntu branding in use. So Drupal actually has UI standards. Can anyone raise their hands if they knew that they existed? Can anyone raise their hands if they've used them? I feel bad. I feel like I'm twisting the knife in your Bojhan, because I know you and Roy spent a lot of time, many hours working on it, but it doesn't get used as often as it should. It exists and it doesn't get used. So there's obviously a lot of potential room for improvement there. So I'm not saying you should use Bootstrap. But what I'm saying is Bootstrap is a very good example of a front-end framework for back-end developers. Its documentation is actually really good and it's very intuitive. One of the problems with Bootstrap is that it isn't very opinionated. It pretty much just gives you any possible UI widget component you could need for some app. It doesn't have any use cases. It just throws everything at you and doesn't really tell you when you should use any of it. But it is very influential, I think, for me anyway, because it's a great example of something that has become so popular because it is so easy to use and implement. So going forward in the future, you can actually see it, it's not moving. So going forward in the future, I hope in the next few years we can kind of build on the style guide we have now and build on the documentation and add best practices to kind of build our own user interface guidelines that are really intuitive for developers to use. And I hope that core and contrib developers will be able to build much better UIs with the style guide. Thank you. So this is a cool conversation. So we made sure we left loads of time for questions. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, what's the roadmap for the style guide? No, I was just wondering about the roadmap that you guys have got in place to create the style guide. Have you?
So right now we got very worried about the deadline for Drupal 8. So we had to move very quickly from making the style guide to actually trying to get it into core. So we're actually still doing that. And once we've done that, we hope that we can go back to style guide, look at it again, add more examples, like I was saying, try and find new patterns in contrib, and try and just make it more useful for developers, because right now it's very bare bones. Anything to add, Bojhan?
So I guess it all depends as well on when Drupal gets out. But we think like getting all of the styles into core will take like another 3 or 4 months. And after that, we can start developing the style guide. But that obviously helps. So it's going to be a lot of work.
So I guess that dovetails to what I was going to ask about. So for the module developer style guide, what are the major holes in that still need to be developed? Or is it a state where your typical standard module can just use it and most things should be covered? I'm assuming like it doesn't yet have guidelines for something as complex as views or panels or rules. But for just your ordinary run-of-the-mill module, do you feel it's at a state where module developers can just look at it and say, cool, I'll just do what that says, or are there still big gaps in it?
Yeah, there are huge gaps in it. It's nowhere near the level that I would be happy with for module developers just to pick it up. Really, right now, it is just showing you the components, which is better than what we were doing before, but there's not nearly enough advice about when and how to use it. So big gaps.
Are there things module developers can do to help that along, who don't have a design eye but may be able to identify, here's a problem I keep coming up with in my UIs, what do I do?
So first of all, we'd love more feedback on the actual standards that we have now. There's a comment field below them. So that's something where you can add your comments, but we're really acting on little feedback as to how it's actually used. Partly because it's probably not used a whole lot, but for those who do use it, we'd love more feedback as to what we can add. I think in terms of your previous question, another thing is that it's relatively easy to describe a pattern and how it should be used, and how suggestions how to use it better, etc. But it's really hard to give kind of an overview as how you should organize your elements, because just putting them on a page is generally the easy part. Figuring out whether you need extra tabs or whether you should place it somewhere else in the information architecture, that's like a larger question that a lot of kind of contrib developers struggle with, or just decide to do, well, this probably makes sense, that they could help with. But that's also kind of a larger question that generally needs some like vision behind it, whether, you know, what audience you're serving with which page.
It's also worth pointing out that we do host UX Happy Hour every week still.
Yeah.
Every week, and module developers are more than welcome to come along if they have any UX problems or questions. That's always been available.
Yeah.
I should have said this before, but I think you guys are doing a great job. I reckon it's looking really awesome. And my second question was, what's your vision for the actual platform that you're going to present this style guide on? Because when I see it on Drupal.org, obviously there's no way to navigate it right now, and you're going to need that when you create more patterns and these kind of things. So what's your plan?
So around the time the style guide was posted, I was working on a style guide presentation framework called Tensile that allows you to display how the components work at different screen sizes. It lets you drag and drop stuff around. But I didn't have a lot of time to actually work on the presentation framework itself, because we were so busy implementing the style guide. And since then, there are, I don't know, probably about 1,000 new style guide frameworks that are out there. So I think Sam Richards has developed one for his SAS components. I know Hedley Smith has worked on one called Agile Patterns, and then I was speaking to Brad Frost the other week about Pattern Lab, which is another like really useful presentation framework. None of them do exactly what we need with all the documentation and stuff like that, but I would much rather work with one of them to get, you know, a framework we can use that's really good than work on my own. So it's still up in the air about how we decide to present it, but it probably won't be on Drupal.org because of the UI limitations. Sorry, there was someone.
Hi, I also wanted to start by saying awesome, good work. And I have two questions. One of them is, at the moment you haven't shown a lot about how the whole thing is changing for mobile. Like I did see the vertical tabs, for example, that turn into collapsible field sets and things like that. But I think a truly mobile first approach actually needs a bit more than just that. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and see some of the work you've been doing in that area. And the other question is, like, for example, me as a designer, I'd be happy to do stuff, but what I found quite hard in comparison to, for example, to just contribute a module or work on issues, that it's harder to get into it. Like, how do you approach Drupal as a designer, and what's the stuff that you're looking for? Like, how can we guys help you?
I really wish you were in the core conversation we had yesterday, because we were actually talking about trying to solve that problem, about having designers contribute to core. But for your first question, so yeah, mobile UX was a big passion of mine a few years ago. And I started, like, one of the first things I did in Drupal core is I wanted to redesign the mobile UX completely. Like, I started from scratch and I just built a prototype with no relation to how Drupal worked on a desktop. But that ended up being extremely difficult to actually execute, because everything is broken up per issue and you have to do component at a time. So being able to control the whole experience, you know, and put that in one patch or something was basically impossible. So I learned a hard lesson. So it is actually very difficult to take an interface that wasn't designed to be mobile friendly at all and adapt it to be completely mobile first. And when the style guide came up, it was an opportunity to basically redesign everything in one go, you know, a little bit. So we had an opportunity to take some of the components that really struggled on mobile interfaces and redesign them so they work both on mobile and desktop, like, with the same design. And the tabs are a really good example. The horizontal tabs, they they collapse down to a collapsible, expandable menu based on the amount of tabs there are and the size of the screen. It's some JavaScript algorithm to work it out. It's really clever, and maybe I could demo it, but Bojhan, do you have anything to add?
No.
Sorry, and your second question was, how do I get involved into core? Or how do I contribute? We have, design-wise.
It's quite clear.
Yes. That's a tough question because the issue queue works really well for developers and not as well for designers. And we're still trying to figure out whether we need a separate sub-site like design.drupal.org with the right flow to facilitate design, or if we can improve Drupal.org itself to make its tools easier for designers to contribute to. So I don't have an answer, but we're trying to figure it out. You know, if you could help us or have any input in that process, it'd be great.
Yeah, I can actually. The best way right now to get involved is that we have meetings every Monday on IRC where we kind of discuss the design activities that all the people in the UX team are doing. And even if you're just lurking, that is a good way to get kind of a heads up as what's going on and where you can be involved. Obviously, it's not ideal, and we know that. So yeah, like these, like Lewis was saying, having a sub-site or at least having some kind of explanation what the flow should be and where people can help out is something that we do want to do in the future. Yeah.
Just wanted to say, like, not many designers use IRC chats.
Yeah, that's true.
I did also want to say that we have a front-end sprint this Friday at the sprint day. So if you come down there, and we'll gladly, if anyone wants to get involved, we'll gladly help anyone out who's never done any core development at all or any design work with core.
Yeah. Okay, question.
Yeah, so first of all, I actually wasn't aware of the UX hour thing. So I'm more a module developer, so that is actually super useful and really cool thing, but so I wasn't aware of it, so I don't know if it might make sense to make that more public in any way, or I mean, it might be just me that I missed it, but yeah, and so another thing, I really love the work all of you've been doing, and I get that you said that it's important to write up, like in the style guide, to write up very specific details on the decision-making process that you went through and be very exhaustive. And I get that, but then on the other side, when I'm writing a new module and I'm writing an admin interface for it, and it's maybe not just a simple form, so I have to do I get into the question of what UI to make. I really there's a really different use case, because I don't need at that point I really don't need all the reasons. I just need this canonical source. So the designers have decided this and that, and I'm fine with it, because at that point I don't care. So I just need basically just need a screenshot, do this, and another screenshot with a big red X, don't do this. So just for an example, in Drupal 7, this was a real revelation for me when we introduced vertical tabs, and it was the coolest thing. So I thought, just do vertical tabs everywhere, and I posted a patch that did 3 levels of nested vertical tabs, and I thought it was the best interface ever that I'd just done. And then someone came in there and said please don't do that, and so that was a really, really good moment for me, because that was a teaching moment. Yeah, so.
It'd be pretty cool to have a forum where you could post your ideas for your interface. There'd be some sort of feedback process where designers could pick up on that and offer a solution.
Yeah, so we try to do that in IRC meetings, and we have a needs usability review tag. You can apply that. The UX team is watching also for contrib. So whenever you tag your issue like that, that's something that we will look at. And about your point, it's true. The proposal that we put up on groups.drupal.org was a very different audience, and it was really aimed at core developers and kind of making sure that they buy into our ideas, because they have to be the ones that also advocate it when people do it wrong. And the guidelines, obviously, yeah, they do have to be very clear on what you should use and shouldn't use, and obviously they shouldn't be spelling out all of the rationale why it's a tiny bit lighter blue than the other one. So yeah. Right. Other.
I just have a quick question. Does user accessibility include 508 accessibility check on Drupal.org, like for contrib modules or for just core?
So if we are checking contrib or
contrib or core in general.
So so the accessibility team obviously is doing a lot of that work where they're checking it. So we did show the whole style guide to them. And in a lot of cases, what happens in core kind of flows out all over contrib. So if we make decisions that are accessible, that generally transpires into the contrib community. Does that answer your question, or?
Sort of.
Okay. Other questions?
I was more kind of looking like some of the images, they list all text. That's a big private accessibility because I work for a company and we have like big government clients and they are really focused on 508.
Right. So a lot of those issues aren't necessarily like style guide or design issues. It's more like how it's implemented technically, and whether we, for example, by default require image fields to have alt text. That's one of those discussions that not everyone is on board with that idea. But ideally, the accessibility team takes care of making sure whatever we design, that is implemented fully correctly, of the right area labels and all of that stuff, so that it is completely accessible. Other questions?
With the what you were talking about before, with the hashtag, is it to notify you guys that it's a UX? What can you elaborate on that? Is there anywhere where you can go, or is it just the IRC channel to see like a list of that sort of thing? Like, I mean, I think that there's people out there that want to help, and I feel like that's a pretty important thing to solve, because I mean, obviously you guys have got your hands full, like just getting things ready for Drupal 8, but I mean, I, for example, am a designer, and I would like to contribute to some extent, but yeah, maybe I'll come along to the IRC, but wouldn't it be cool to see a list? Or?
So there is a list, and as it happens, I have a slide for that. So the style guide issue tag lists every single style guide related issue we're working on right now. So it'd be a great place for you to help.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.